Human trafficking for the purpose of labor exploitation might be more difficult to detect and prosecute because it is related sometimes to legitimate businesses and workers who are recruited through agencies and maybe on construction sites, working in a cleaning sector for even a public agency, would be difficult to extract from their predicament because they might be afraid about reporting the abuse that they're suffering.
So first of all, legislation. It's essential, right, that we get the right legislation in or out there. And the second, and that's the one usually forgotten because sometimes we do have the legislation, it is the enforcement of that legislation.
One of the main issues in our region, the Baltic Sea region, is that the number of victims are increasing, but the prosecutions and convictions are clearly decreasing or at very low levels. We still have a situation where judges do not apply the international definition of the human trafficking legislation, but apply their own definitions. And the consequence is that perpetrators and criminals go unpunished in the region. And the risk is that the Baltic Sea region is viewed by organized crime as a free area when it comes to conducting these crimes.
When we exploit and dehumanize human beings, it also has to do a lot about our own kind of humanity as well. So this kind of inhuman bondage between employers and the employee who's been exploited, those kind of relations destroy our social fabric.
It's for every country to actually acknowledge that there is a problem. There has to be political attention and a political will to address it because, as I said, sometimes you have legitimate businesses or even public procurement, which is a vehicle to this form of trafficking. So you need to open your eyes to it, and then you have to take a political decision to address it through an action plan or strategy, and to have legislation which is really appropriate.
So there's very little point in creating laws and then making a lot of noise about it if it turns out that you're completely unable to enforce the laws. Why is that an issue? Because at the end of the day, the first thing that needs to happen if we want to tackle the issue of economic exploitation is we have to find them, we have to detect them. And if there are no people out there looking for them, which is in particular social inspection people or labor inspection, if they're not out there checking, and if there is not a system behind them that can actually start up investigations through, be it police, be it the prosecutor's office, etc., well, then I'm afraid your legal system has very little point.
We have a lot of laws and also international obligations, but we see that in real life they're not always implemented. The number of prosecutions and convictions for this form of trafficking are still very low. And victims, when they're identified, the risk is that they are quickly sent back to their countries without the possibility to claim back wages, compensation, and other rights.
We need to look state by state and explore and overview the current legislations and whether the international definitions are in fact applied when it comes to labor exploitation. And there is an immediate and urgent need to train judges. In the same way, judges have been trained for different types of crimes and legislation through the years, such as violence against women, the same procedures and trainings we need to see when it comes to human trafficking.
So this is the first step. The other step is to really work with businesses, to raise their awareness of their obligations, and also to put into place legal tools, for example, to make businesses accountable and to ask them to report publicly about what steps they're taking in order to mitigate the risks of labor exploitation throughout their operations and supply chains. And a third area is to raise awareness in a very broad way amongst consumers, amongst the general public, but also amongst migrant workers about the risks, their rights, where to look for help. So it's an all society effort that is required.
So a kind of a global forum that discusses all of this and develops a kind of a framework that allows us to resolve these things in really comprehensive and systemic way, I think is very essential.
Right? You can increase your detection, and there you are with 100 victims. But if the second step, the investigation, the prosecution, isn't able to follow, or the help, if you find 100 people who all of a sudden, when detected, need shelter, need support, if all of that is not available, then there's very little point in creating that law in the first place.
And I think that is really important part, and this forum today initiated that discussion with state actors present, with lots of other actors from charities, from public spaces, from civil servants, with academics and NGOs, and so many other kind of actors coming together and discussing and trying to understand each other. That is where everything begins. And I think this forum opened that space, that safe space for those kind of really difficult conversations to happen.
I like this event very much. The event is not shying away from putting the finger on really thorny issues.
The purpose of the forum was to gather stakeholders that have not necessarily been that involved in the work against human trafficking, but should be involved to a higher extent. So it's great to see this number of big participants participating at the European Forum today.
It is the first conference specifically with so many different players internationally from so many different fields, specifically on the topic of economic exploitation. How are we going to deal with this?